Welcome back to Dark Night Scare. In today's video, I am sharing 6 food delivery, true terrifying stories. Stay tuned and please subscribe this channel and like this video. Thank you all. Now let's start. I began working when I was 16, right here in my town, which is in the suburbs of a large city. Initially, they had me assisting the chef in the kitchen and helping to keep the place clean. After about 2 months, my boss told me that on the main delivery boy's days off, I would be handling the deliveries. I agreed, of course. Then, quite suddenly, the delivery boy quit. He came back from delivering a pizza to one house, looking absolutely traumatized and shaken, like something terrible had happened. His face and eyes gave him away. He went into my boss's office and they argued for roughly 15 minutes. He came out afterward and said, "Good luck, kid," and informed me he had quit. I asked why, and he simply said, "It's just a shitty job, that's all." He patted me on the back and left. I suspected it was something more than just a bad job, but I didn't dwell on it. That was the last time I ever saw him. So, for the following couple of weeks, I was the delivery boy until they could find someone else to take over delivering pizzas. Around 2 weeks into doing the deliveries myself, my boss gave me an address. As usual, I punched it into the GPS and set off, driving while watching the sunset. I was hoping the delivery would only take a couple of minutes so I could get home. Unfortunately, it was out on the rural side of town, where houses are spaced about a quarter-mile apart. I stopped in front of a 2-story house and looked at it. I got the creepiest feeling when I stared at it. The lawn wasn't cut. Weeds were everywhere, dead trees, and the old porch was bare, with no chairs, flower pots, or tables, just completely empty. It seemed abandoned, but I got out anyway and knocked on the door. I was hoping my boss had given me the wrong address or something so I could get out of there. Then, the door lock started shaking, and the door opened. An old lady, at least 70 years old, stood there, with white hair, missing teeth, and very skinny. She was also very short, but her eyes were just glaring at me. It really freaked me out. I figured if I was nice, things would turn out okay. "After all," I said, trying to be as friendly as possible. "Pepperoni pizza, ma'am." She said yes, with a hoarse voice, as if she had a sore throat. "Alrighty, here you go," I said, handing the pizza over. But she just looked at it with no emotion and didn't take it. She went to get her purse and asked, "Did you come with someone else?" I froze, then quickly looked up at her, still glaring. That question really frightened me. No," I said. "Where's the other one?" "He ran off on me the last time he came," she said. I thought, that didn't make sense. "He quit some weeks ago," I said. Then she got her purse and started searching, through it for money, or so I thought she was doing. It took about a minute, the longest minute ever. With her hands still in her purse, she stopped searching and looked at me. It wasn't a look of surprise or confusion, but just as if she were thinking really hard about something. I could tell. She was holding something in her right hand inside the purse, but I couldn't see what it was. I really started to freak out at this point. What if it was pepper spray, or a knife, or even a gun? I mean, what could possibly take her so long to get $10 out of her purse? Then, behind her, I saw a shadow, a silhouette of a man coming to the door. All of a sudden, I heard footsteps crushing leaves on my left side, next to the porch. A man's deep voice said, "Hey!" I looked over and saw the head of a middle-aged man, looking angry, peering over the porch. This guy then started to climb up the porch, and that was when I realized I'd had enough. I darted to my car, threw the pizza inside, turned the key, and drove off. I didn't look back. As I drove off into the dark, I had to lie and pay for the pizza out of my own pocket, but it was worth it. On the day I quit, I decided to tell my boss what had happened that evening. He freaked out too and asked me why I hadn't told him. He said James had told him something like he'd just walked out of there and hadn't paid attention to her. My boss then called the cops to look into the sketchy situation. He told me I could leave. About 2 days later, He called back saying the cops had the house registered as foreclosed for over a year. When they broke in, they found 3 people living there, the 2 men and the old lady I'd encountered. They were arrested. He didn't tell me anything else. I'm still traumatized, and I don't know what would have happened if I had waited. They could have easily jumped me, but thank God I quit afterward and I'm still alive. I'll never forget the time I was covering a friend's shift at the pizzeria we worked at. He was the delivery boy, while I was usually the one at the register. On that night, I made 2 regular deliveries to normal people. Then, my manager gave me one final delivery for the night. It was 5 miles away, which was a long drive for what I was used to. The GPS told me to turn off the highway into some very quiet town, one I'd somehow never even heard of. The GPS took me down some side roads that were even more deserted than the main streets in that town. Half of the streetlights weren't even on. I didn't like the looks of this place at all. I just wanted to deliver the pizza and be gone. So I arrived at the house. It was a small, single-story place. I rang the bell, and almost immediately the door swung open. An older man, maybe in his upper 50s, opened the door. His few remaining hairs were grey, and he had a very pale face with a grey moustache. He gave me a smile and told me he'd be right back, then walked away into his house, out of view. I just stood there in the cold, waiting for him. I was a little uncomfortable with the area, and the way the guy looked didn't help. I heard stomping on creaky floors inside the house as the man reappeared at the doorway, still smiling. He said, I should come inside where it's warm while I waited. I told him it was okay, but he just kept nudging me, hinting for me to come inside. I can't justify my actions, but it was freezing outside, maybe around 5 degrees. Foolishly, I stepped inside, the house of a sketchy stranger. He shut the door behind me and hurried off into another room. It wasn't much warmer in the house. He clearly didn't even have a heating system. I found myself creeping closer and closer to the door as I got more and more uncomfortable. Then, the man came out of another room and gave me another smile. He opened a door that apparently led to the basement. He looked down and told me that he normally leaves his money down there. He asked me to come down there with him. I refused. Even from where I was standing, I could see it was totally pitch dark down there. And then what happened next is where it all fell apart. I heard the sound of a creaking step coming from the basement. Somebody else was down there. I decided it was time to go and turned around to open the door, but the man was already right on top of me. I punched him in the face and managed to get him in a hold, but I heard somebody stomping up the basement steps. I had to get out of there. I pushed the man to the floor, ran outside, got in my car, and drove off without looking back. I told my manager everything and he called the cops, but I don't know whatever became of that. My manager gave me a couple of days off afterward. Since then, I am much wiser to the fact that you should never enter a stranger's house. I was out doing a delivery one late night. It was probably the longest drive I have ever taken for a pizza delivery from the place I worked. It was a 20-minute drive, which isn't too crazy out where I live, plus they ordered 4 large pizzas. So, I figured it was a party and I would get a much bigger tip. Navigating the dirt roads at night was always annoying though. I pulled up to the given address. It was some old sketchy-looking building, literally in the middle of a forest clearing. There were no cars parked anywhere and no lights on. I put my car in park and called my boss. I asked him to reread the address at least 3 times to make sure I'd typed it in correctly, but it checked out. I could tell he was in a really bad mood and told me to at least knock on the door and check it out. He would normally get mad if we took back 1 pizza, but I was afraid of what he would do if I brought back 4. I was incredibly unnerved, but got out anyway and forced myself to the front door of the building. There was no doorbell, so I just knocked really hard. I heard nothing and didn't really expect to hear anything. I was extremely disappointed, not because nobody answered the door, but because I was realizing it was all a waste of time and gas. I knocked one more time out of desperation and then began to hear some kind of rustling noises from inside the building. I knocked again and yelled that I was the pizza guy. There was silence. Now I felt even more uncomfortable than before. But before I could turn around, I noticed something at the window. Someone was looking through the window. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. All I noticed were their eyes. Their eyes were open wider than I knew possible, staring intently at me. I was disturbed enough by this and dropped the pizzas, running back to my car. The stupid thing wouldn't start until I turned the key for the third time. I drove off the grass and back onto the dirt road, but I felt the car rocking, shaking, and bumping into something. Something wasn't right. I didn't get far from the building before I started hearing a sharp scraping sound coming from outside. There was so much resistance that I couldn't even drive. The car came to a stop. I got out to check what the hell was wrong. A chill ran up my spine as I began to feel like my heart was constantly skipping beats. My tires had been slashed and had completely fallen off the rims. Not just the front though, all 4 tires were slashed. I realized somebody had done this while I was knocking on the door to that building. Instead of running, I got back in the car and locked the doors. I was so close to that building, I could practically see it from where I was if it weren't for the trees blocking the view. I dialed 911 and explained everything to the operator. She told me the cops would be over as soon as possible and that I needed to stay hidden. I asked her if it was advisable to stay in the car or run, and she told me it would be best to stay in the car with the doors locked. She asked me to stay on the line with her until the cops arrived. My whole body was shaking in all directions. There was nothing but dark, seemingly endless forest. I knew it would take forever for the cops to get there. I was not comfortable sitting in that car so close to whoever did this. The next part, though, is what utterly destroyed me. It still shakes me to this day, and I hope nobody ever has to experience this kind of fear. As I was scanning all the windows, making sure nobody was outside, I looked in the rearview mirror, and there was the same person. The same person I saw at that window, eyes open wider than ever. I could see now that it was a woman, and I could ever so slightly see a smile beginning to spread across her face. I opened my door and full-on sprinted into the woods, not caring how much noise I made. I ran until I was out of breath, which didn't take long, and hid behind a giant log on the ground. I tried to cover my loud breathing with my hand as I waited, and waited for what felt like hours until I finally heard sirens in the distance. I gathered up all the stamina I had left to run all the way back in the direction of the dirt road. Eventually, the glowing red and blue lights came into view, and I had never felt better in my life. They were parked in front of my car, investigating, with flashlights. I came out yelling at them like a lunatic to help me. I fell to the floor and started to gag, almost throwing up from running so much. They picked me up and began to question me. I explained everything to the best of my ability. One of the 2 cars drove over to the building, and the 2 officers began to search it. They came back with nothing except for a couple of spiky objects. These objects were exactly the same as the ones used to slash my tires. The cops guessed that it was some kind of sick, deranged couple, being that I saw the woman, but unfortunately, they were never found. And that still kills me to this day. I obviously quit my job right after that and started working at a local grocery store. I know that I'll never forget seeing that woman at the back of my car. My job as a new breed driver at night was to make a little extra cash. Friday and Saturday nights were always the busiest because everyone's either home or with friends ordering food. So those were the nights I typically worked. I received a request on a Saturday night at 1 a.m. to pick up McDonald's for a guy named Kyle. He lived a few minutes away from my current location, so I went to the nearest McDonald's, which was only a 2-minute drive, and picked up his order. It was a small order. I think he only wanted 2 hamburgers. His place was about 5 to 7 minutes from the McDonald's. I followed the app's directions to his house, and eventually, it led me to a short dead-end street branching off another dead-end street. The house was the last one on this cul-de-sac, situated right next to a line of trees bordering a highway. Although it was pretty much dead given how late it was, I didn't want to ring the bell, so I called Kyle's number. It rang once, then went straight to voicemail, so I hung up. However, I then got a text from him telling me to just come to the door, so that's what I did. I arrived at the large wooden front porch of the house, and soon the front door opened. A bald man answered, didn't look very young, perhaps in his 30s, and his head was completely bald. Maybe he was sick or just liked that look, so I didn't judge. However, his breath was disgusting, and he seemed quite drunk, which was a bit off-putting. The payments were handled through the app, so normally there was no need to wait around for cash. But this time, Kyle asked me to bring the pizza onto his kitchen table while he went down to the basement to get a tip. I didn't object to free money, so I waited in his kitchen, which, by the way, was only lit by a small outlet-sized nightlight, making it pretty dim in there. The entire kitchen smelled rather disgusting, though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. Kyle was taking an awfully long time fetching this tip from the basement, so I started to wonder a bit. I stepped into the living room adjacent to the kitchen. The TV was on in there, which was the only reason I could see anything. However, the stench was even stronger in this room. Then I noticed the back door was slid open about halfway. Maybe he was trying to air out whatever that horrible odor was. For lack of better judgment, I walked to the back door expecting a quick breath of fresh air, but the smell only intensified. Then finally, I stepped outside onto the man's back deck. I heard the sound of flies, like a swarm of them, right by the door. Then, I guess a motion sensor light detected my presence and turned on, revealing 2 large black garbage bags stuffed with what looked like 2 long objects. The smell was unbearable. It took me a second to register what I was most likely looking at. Suddenly, waiting around for the tip didn't seem like a very good idea anymore. I went back inside and rushed to the front door. Just then, I heard Kyle emerge from the basement, calling out to me, holding a few single bills in his hand. He saw me as I was about to open the door and asked where I was going. I had to come up with an excuse, so I said I was just rushing to check if I had something in my car. He said, "Oh, okay," as he came over and handed me the bills. Then he turned towards the back door of the porch where the light was still on. He looked back at me, and his gummy smile seemed to be disappearing. He asked me in a firm voice if I'd gone to his backyard. I told him no, and he just stared at me, not saying anything. I didn't give him the time of day anymore. I opened the door and walked out, but not before he grabbed my shoulder as I got onto the stoop. I ripped his hand off my shoulder and ran to my car. I saw him run back inside, leaving the front door still open. I started my car and sat there, watching his front door, curious to see if he'd come back out. And he did. He came back out running, full speed towards my car, holding a large metal rod. I drove away from his house, ready to call the police and report him. I called as soon as I got down the block, making sure to leave him no time to dispose of those potentially dead bodies. I drove down the block and saw police cars pull up, literally within 2 minutes. I watched the whole thing. I told the police where to go. Meanwhile, Kyle, if that was even his real name, had already started moving the bags, which did contain dead bodies, towards the bushes in his backyard. Everything about this guy was off, for leaving the back door open, revealing dead bodies to a pizza delivery driver. He might have been deranged, but he also wasn't the smartest man around. I delivered food for an Asian eatery in my town. It was the best job I could get at my age, mainly for the tips alone. My friend and I worked there together. We were actually the only 2 drivers. My friend usually worked the counter and took phone calls while I handled deliveries, which is how I preferred it. During one night shift we worked together, my friend got off the phone and told me I'd be doing a delivery once the food was ready. I was given a brown paper bag and set off on my way. The address led me to a small dirt driveway off the main road, leading to an enclosed property. Don't picture it as some luxurious private estate though. It was an old, unkempt excuse for a property, and the house seemed deserted. No lights on inside, and the grass was incredibly high. I called my friend back at the restaurant, and he passed the phone to their boss. Unfortunately, our boss is a real stench, so he yelled at me in a thick accent to knock on the door and not waste the food. I got out of my car and felt the grass brushing against my shins. That's how tall it was. I walked up the 3 stairs to the front door and knocked loudly, as there didn't seem to be a doorknob. After waiting for 30 seconds, there was no answer, so I got back in my car. The first thing I did was start texting my friend back at the restaurant. But when I looked back up at the house, one of the upstairs lights inside was now turned on. So I went back to the door and knocked again. On the first knock, the door pushed open slightly. Someone had opened it, but there was no one standing by the door. I pushed it open a little more and called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed through the empty house. I was waiting to hear footsteps come to the door, but they never came. Obviously, someone had to have opened the door, so if they weren't coming to the door, I had to assume they wanted me to come in. I stepped into the house, my shoes creaking on the wood floor. I called out one more time, and this time, someone replied back. I heard the words, "Aquí arriba." Now, I'm not fluent in Spanish by any means, but I knew that aquí meant here, and arriba meant above. I put 2 and 2 together and figured they said, up here. There was a stairway in the middle of the hallway, so I walked over to it, stopped at the bottom step, and looked up the stairs. All I saw at the top was an arm reaching out over the ledge, making a little stiff "come here" motion. I used what little Spanish skills I'd picked up in middle school and said something like, "Tengo tu comida," as I began walking up the stairs. As I got about halfway up, the arm wasn't there anymore. I reached the top, looking for whoever had been standing by the ledge over the stairs. I noticed, through the faintest light, that the person was now inside a bedroom with the lights off. But again, I didn't see the actual person, just the person's arm doing that same "come here" motion. Everything above the person's elbow was faded to black in that room. It was such an eerie sight. I knew for certain I wasn't going into that room though. So, I said firmly, "Look, buddy, I'm not going in there. You come out here with the money, or I'm leaving." Suddenly, the arm pulled back into the darkness of the room. After a few seconds of standing there in silence, I was hit by a flying object. It happened so fast that it took me a few moments to realize I'd just been hit with a stiff, severed arm. It wasn't some plastic Halloween toy. It was a real arm. I ran down the stairs, still holding the food, and got back to my car. I didn't even call my friend or my boss. I drove straight to the nearest neighbor's house and rang their doorbell. When they answered, I told them what their neighbor had just done to me. The woman had the most puzzled look on her face. She said nobody had lived in that house for a year. My stomach dropped when those words hit me. She said she would call the police after we talked about it for a good 5 minutes. Then I went back to the restaurant with the food. I explained the best I could to my boss, and he let it go. I sometimes wonder how things would have played out if I'd gone into that room and who or what I would have found. I used to work at Domino's. They close at 3 a.m. on weekends. Since I was taking an off year during college at the time this story takes place, my boss took advantage and always put me on the 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. shifts. There would always be at least 3 people working that late. 1 to cook the pizzas, 1 to take orders, and 1 for any needed deliveries. On this particular night, the cook was Jeff, a 28-year-old Italian guy who worked 2 jobs. He was always in a bad mood. So when he told me to deliver something, I did it without complaint. So, being a Saturday night, it wasn't unusual to get calls for deliveries past 2 a.m. Around 2:30, I was told to deliver 2 pizzas to an address I still vaguely remember, something like 27 Crocker Drive. I took my beat-up 2002 Honda Civic down the road for about 5 minutes onto the only main road cutting through our tiny town. I live in the Manchester Township area of New Jersey, which is pretty much just trees everywhere. After merging off the main road onto smaller roads with no streetlights, the only light visible for miles were my headlights. I turned off the public road onto a dirt road where a private property sign was posted. It seemed I had arrived at the house. Suddenly, I heard a bang reverberating through my car, followed by a weakened sense of handling and a repeating flopping sound. I knew for certain I'd just gotten a flat tire. I stopped the car immediately and got out to confirm. The front right tire was completely flat. I could see through the headlights that the house was within walking distance from my car though. So instead of calling my insurance company, it made more sense to deliver the pizza and ask the person there for help. I walked to the deck of the house. It was an average-sized house, completely surrounded by trees, like most of the houses around here. The lights were on inside, but all the blinds were shut. I rang the bell, and quickly a normal-looking young man answered the door. Before exchanging the pizzas for money, I told the man about the predicament I'd just found myself in. A look of concern came over his face as he handed me the money, and I handed over the pizzas. He came outside to look at my car with me. It was a 30-second walk from the house. He got to my car and started examining the tire. He said he could help me, he just needed his tools from inside. I started wondering what I could have hit on his dirt driveway, and he yelled out to me, "Don't worry about it," as I was walking back down his driveway. I walked a bit further, mostly ignoring him, when I noticed a spike strip in the road. A very small one, but definitely what I hit. I couldn't think of any other reason for it to be there except him putting it there deliberately. I started thinking over the possibilities of what could be going on, so I pretended I didn't see the spike strip and walked back, saying I hadn't found anything. He looked at me. I was worried he might be suspicious, but then he turned away and said he was going inside to get some tools. God only knows what he meant by tools. I waited until he got to his front door before getting back in my car, starting it and putting it in reverse. I was not sticking around there to find out what he was doing. I heard the flat tire wobble on the dirt road as my car slowly rolled backward. I made a point of avoiding the spike strip this time. My car pulled out of the private dirt road onto the concrete road. I took one last look down the man's driveway to make sure he wasn't following me. Then I took off. I couldn't drive too fast though, risking further damage to my wheel, so I stayed at a steady 10 to 15 miles per hour. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw something behind my car, the man running after my car. I had no choice but to floor it, forcing me to cringe as I could literally feel the damage being done to my wheel. The distance between my car and the man got greater until he was out of sight. After turning back onto the main road I'd mentioned earlier, I slowed down a bit, back to 10 to 15 miles per hour. It was a long ride back, about 20 minutes since I had to drive slow. When I got back, the police would be closing in. It had only been about 10 minutes, but I had to return the Domino's sign they make us put on our cars for deliveries. Jeff was upset with me that I took so long until I told him the whole story. The woman who was also working the shift listened, her face the whole time showing shock. When it came time to close, Jeff told me I should just drive home slow since I lived, like right down the block, and that I should deal with it the next day. The two of them went off to their cars and drove away. I sat in my car for a little bit, thinking. Eventually, I started my car and began the slow drive back to my house. I noticed, however, that a car without its lights on was following close, behind me for a while. So, I pulled over in front of a small house to see if they would do the same. The car passed me, but then pulled over on the same side of the street a little further down. I started to panic, knowing it had to be the man who had figured out I'd gone to the Domino's he ordered from. I couldn't lead him to my house, so even though I didn't know for sure it was him, I had to be overly paranoid and call the cops. I had the police come directly to my location out of fear of being followed. After waiting for 5 to 10 minutes, a cop car slowly rolled down the street, and I honked my horn to get him to stop. He stopped in reverse so his windows were lined up with mine, and then we both rolled them down. I pointed at the car in front of me, lights off, sitting a little further ahead. But just then, that car zoomed out from its parked position, lights still off, instantly disappearing down the road into the night. The cop turned on his lights and sped after him without saying a word. I didn't know if he wanted me to follow him, but I couldn't with my tire, so I drove home as quickly as I could and parked my car in the driveway. I still don't know if that cop caught the driver somehow. I doubt it, but I like to imagine he did. Either way, I always made sure to watch my back every time I drove home after that night, and I quit that job 2 months later.